I'll start. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Cardiff-Japanese Online Lecture Series, exploring sociocultural aspects of Japanese language learning today. My name is Mayu Negami Hanford. I'm a lecturer in Japanese studies in modern languages in Cardiff University. We would like to say thank you for the Japan Foundation for supporting this event as well. And thank you everyone for coming. Today, let me talk about the purpose of this Cardiff Japanese Lecture Series first. Okay, the purpose of this webinar is to share contemporary relevant information and to understand cultural context for recognizing the multi-faced aspect of Japanese society in a broader sense. And we aim at exploring sociocultural aspects of language learning for those studying Japanese language and culture, and as well as various learners, teachers, and researchers with an interest in Japan. And for the third lecture of the series today, we have invited Professor Michael Handford, Cardiff University, and then Mike will give the lecture titled "We Japanese are more polite than others, Intercultural Communication and Stereotypes." And before the lecture starts, let me tell you about today's schedule and related matters for the webinar. One sec. So as you see this slide, after this opening, the lecture starts. Then after the lecture, we will review the questions from the audience. Then we are planning to close this webinar at 1 o'clock. And while the webinar, all your microphones will be muted. And this webinar is being recorded. And recorded session video will be in Cardiff University's School of Modern Languages YouTube channel. And I'll be putting a link to you in the chat box later. While the lecture, please type any questions regarding the lecture you have in the Q&A box as we review them after the lecture. And please do not type your questions in the chat box. And also, please do not use the raise hand function while the lecture, okay? And then, now let me introduce Professor Handford's profile to you just a little bit. Oh, sorry. Oh, by the way, this is the Cardiff University Modern Languages YouTube channel. So I'm going to send you a link to this later. And we've got the Cardiff-Japanese Lecture Series YouTube channel as well. Okay, so Professor Michael Handford is Chair of Applied Linguistics at Cardiff University, where he is the Director of Internationalization for the School of English Communication and Philosophy and Director of Research for the Center of Language and Communication Research. From 2005 to 2016, he worked at the University of Tokyo as Professor of International Education. He has published on discourse in professional settings, stereotyping at work, essentialism and intercultural communication, English as a lingua franca, and language learning. Okay, thank you, Mike, for coming to this webinar, for giving us this opportunity today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Mayu.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And then now you can share your PowerPoint slide. And then if you play video in your presentation, please click the Zoom function button that says share sound as well. And then when you're ready, please start your lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay, just one second.
I'm going to stop sharing mine, okay?
Yeah, great. I think that's, can you see mine now? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me. As I say, thank you to Mayu and thank you to her colleagues at MLang and the Japan Foundation. This is all, what a great series. So the title of my talk, a little bit contentious maybe, maybe provoked a bit of a reaction. We Japanese are more polite than others. So this is a quote from some research that I'll be talking about later. And it's framed in the general areas of intercultural communication, which of course has a lot of relevance for anybody who's learning languages, and stereotypes, because I think if you're thinking about intercultural communication, stereotypes are always there in one way or another. So I'll be arguing maybe why some stereotypes are quite problematic, and what we can do about them, really. That's the main focus. So let me just move this bit over there. So why this talk? So as I just said, really, so there are these kind of stereotypes, like Japanese are more polite than other nations, when people say that kind of thing. I think they're problematic for a couple of reasons. One, I'll be arguing that they're usually inaccurate, at least, and often false. And I think maybe worse, that they hinder rather than help intercultural communication. And when I'm talking about intercultural communication, I'm talking about communication between people who ascribe different identities to each other. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean at what kind of level. It's often seen at the national level, but it doesn't have to be. My wife, for example, is Japanese. Every time we talk, I wouldn't consider that intercultural communication, for example. Okay, and then there's the question, of course, as learners and teachers, we need to be wary of stereotypes, I think, and we need to be developing what I've termed, or other people have termed as well, critical intercultural competence. And I'll be talking about what that means in practice. So that's the main kind of aim of the talk. Now, let's just, oh yeah, and I'm not arguing that Japanese people are not polite. That's not the point of the talk. When I was doing my master's degree back in the year 2000, I'd just spent 6 years teaching English as a foreign language in Japan. And this was before I worked at Todai. So this kind of 2 stints in Japan. And when I was doing my master's, I read this very well-cited paper by Jenny Thomas, which is talking about politeness. And she said, it is fatuous, you know, it's ridiculous to suggest that an entire people, the Japanese, for example, is actually more polite than another, say the British, simply because they use more elaborate linguistic formula. So we're not dealing with moral or spiritual qualities, only with the linguistic coding of certain attitudes and values. In different cultures, different pragmatic ground rules may be invoked. And this really chimed with a lot of what I'd noticed in Japan. Because of course, on the one hand, you have a lot of people saying, you know, British people are the most polite people in the world, Japanese are the most polite people in the world. But what you have is you have different ways of invoking politeness. Now, of course, you know, every student and speaker of Japanese knows that, you know, politeness is a really complex area in Japanese, in terms of how you linguistically elaborate it, how you express it linguistically. You know, even just the choice of pronouns can be a minefield. But that doesn't mean that Japanese people are more polite. It just means that there are different ways of coding politeness. And we'll talk more about this later. Now, just to give you a little taste of the kind of things I'm looking at, and to get you in the swing, as it were, let's have a quick look at a little quiz. So directing verbs. So directing verbs, these are key words at work. Okay, a lot of my research, as Maya mentioned, talks about workplace communication. I go around recording meetings and stuff like that. So these verbs, or some of these verbs, are very, very frequently used in meetings and business communication, like, you know, you need to do it, that type of thing. So just have a quick look. Which do you think is the most frequent of these verbs, and which do you think is the least frequent? So like, you know, you need to do it, you must do it, you have to do it, you should do it. Just have a quick choice. Which do you think least, which do you think most? Okay, so these are the results based on about 1 million words of business meetings that have been recorded and transcribed. Huge differences, as you can see. Now, this is interesting because the meaning of these words is quite similar, isn't it? You know, need to and must, have to. Often in dictionaries, you'll see that they're synonymous. But in terms of how they're actually used, we see huge differences in speakers. In business, people very, very rarely use must. Why is that? It's because must is seen as quite face-threatening. It can be seen as quite rude in a lot of situations. Whereas we have to is seen as more maybe objective, less personal. Okay, so that's one question. Now, next question is, who uses must more? As I said, must is very rarely used, but in studies, mine and other people's, looking at different nationalities and how they use language, how they use English, who uses must more? So do you want to have a guess? German speakers, Japanese speakers, Spanish speakers, British speakers. Okay, who do you think that? Right, now, stick to your answer. Usually, people say Germans, and they're correct. Okay, the next question is why? Why do German speakers use must far more than these other nationalities when they're speaking English? And I'd like to have a think. Again, you don't have to say the answer, but have a quick think about why that may be the case. How would you explain that to yourself? Here are some answers. So Germans like direct communication. Germans are aggressive communicators. The German language has similar language, and Germans are often rude, or something else. Okay, so choose which one, or which ones you think are the best answer. I've done this lots of times over the years, and usually people choose things like, well, Germans are very direct, or yeah, Germans are a bit rude, or maybe worse stereotypes than that. Now, the actual answer is 3. In German, there's the verb müssen, which is, in terms of semantics, quite similar to English, as you can see, must, müssen. But in terms of the pragmatics, in terms of how they're used in different situations, the German verb müssen is actually much more similar to the English need to or have to. But people don't think about that. So I've got a bit of a problem with my slides. Let's see. Okay, so if you answered 1, 2, or 4, this is really because of your stereotypes. Sorry. I'm not trying to criticize anybody or make them feel bad. We all do this. We all notice things linguistically, and we attribute often things about personality or stereotypes to the various differences. And often they're actually incorrect or too general. And so this is a bit of an issue. So what am I talking about here? So I'm talking about stereotypes, yeah? So these are some aspects of stereotypes that we can think about. Stereotypes are often overgeneralizations. So like, you know, you kind of, all people are like this, whereas in fact, you know, it's much more nuanced than that. And therefore they're either false or they can't be falsified. They can't be proven wrong, you know, so they're almost meaningless, really. They're oppositional in that they evoke these oppositions between the speaker and the other group that the speaker is speaking about, or vice versa. So they create oppositions. They're usually about a social category like age or gender or profession, or very often nationality. And they can be what are termed auto-stereotypes. So auto-stereotypes are about when speakers say something about themselves. So for example, I have a UK passport. So if I said, you know, we British are very reserved, that would be an auto-stereotype. But if I spoke about Japanese people, that would be a hetero-stereotype. So I said Japanese people are very reserved, that would be a hetero-stereotype. Very importantly, stereotypes are by definition evaluative. They're used to make rapid judgments about people. And we need to make rapid judgments quite a lot in life. Evolutionary wise, you know, 100,000 years ago, we needed to make very rapid judgments about tigers and things attacking us because otherwise we'd die. So, you know, this has been kind of ingrained into our minds over a long period of evolution to make quick, rapid judgments, good and bad. But unfortunately, the world that we live in now is so complex that our minds often don't help us. So in a way, we're trying to, through things like critical intercultural communication, learn to deal better with our minds. Now, you may say, well, but it's natural to stereotype. And I could say, yeah, it is natural to stereotype, but it's also natural to live in a tree. But it doesn't mean that we have to do it, does it? You know, this is the advantage of education in many ways. Okay, so here's a few for you here. Are these stereotypes? Japanese people live longer than other nations. British people are very reserved. Engineers are not good at communicating. We Japanese are more polite than others. So which of those are stereotypes and which are not? 2, 3, and 4 are all stereotypes. Number 1 is not. Number 1 you could test. You know, you can quantify that and say whether it's the case or not. Excuse me, say whether it's the case or not. Okay, so here are some common stereotypes about Japan that we'll come across later. So Japanese very polite, Japanese people are very shy, Japanese people are very arrogant, Japanese society is unique. And you could ask the question, are there a lot of stereotypes about Japan, both auto-stereotypes as well as hetero-stereotypes? And I think many people would say yes. There are a lot of stereotypes about Japan. Now, of course, if you want to look at the work of people like Edward Said in terms of Orientalism, there's a lot of stereotypes about any kind of other, anybody that is seen as the other. Naturally, you're going to have stereotypes, these kind of reductive, simplified overgeneralizations. But I think Japan has a very, how would you say, rich, it's fertile soil for the creation of stereotypes. And there's a reason why that I think any student of Japanese should know about, really. And this is what's termed Nihonjinron, the theories of Japanese people. So particularly the work of people like Befu and Sugimoto, but many others as well have critiqued this. So Nihonjinron is this, it's really the dominant identity discourse in Japan. And its main aim is to emphasize the uniquely unique aspects of Japan. So in so many situations, you hear this argument, Japan is a unique country. And it's not just unique as in every other country is unique, it's uniquely unique. Now, I could think of countless examples. So for example, something like, so many times I'd say, well, why is Japan unique to some of my students? They say, well, it has four seasons. And it's like, well, actually lots of other countries have 4 seasons, and you could argue that Japan doesn't have 4 seasons. It probably has 6, along with certainly Honshu, you know, rainy season and typhoon season. So that could be 6 seasons. And so the point is, any of these kind of stereotypes are possible to break down, and these ideas of uniqueness. But it's difficult to overemphasize, I think, for someone who hasn't lived in Japan, just how deep and powerful these narratives are in society. And you see them in newspapers, on TV, lots and lots of different things. And it ties in with this, as I said here, highly essentialist frame of national identity. I'm going to talk a little bit more about essentialism in a minute, but it's this notion that a group has an inherent aspect to it that may not exactly be obvious on the surface, but is very deep. So this kind of essence, a group has a particular essence. It's reflected in Japan in concepts like, you know, Henjapa, Hanjapa, Junjapa, Junsui. These kind of, you know, like you're not proper Japanese. You're a bit of a weird Japanese person, or you're pure blood, or these types of things. You know, and I think these very much tie in with notions of Nihonjinron as well, and build on that. Okay, so well, you might say, yeah, but let's go back to this idea that Japan is the most polite country of the world. Japan is really polite, you know, so what does this mean? And what do we mean by this? So let me just critique this to give you a bit more of an example of what I mean by a kind of critical intercultural communication. Okay, so this kind of statement is just an example. Japan is the most polite country in the world. We could replace it with something else, you know, some other stereotype from some other country. It doesn't really matter. These still apply. Point number 1, each culture has its own norms and practices. However we define a culture, that is the case. Within each nation, there are many cultural groups, okay? So within one nation like Japan, you're going to find lots and lots of different cultural groups, which within different groups, they will have their own different norms and practices. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of these in a minute as well. Now, point number 3, what is rude in one culture may not be rude in another. And point 4 relates to this. There's no global objective standard of politeness. So what do I mean? So it's, for example, something like slurping your noodles. So, you know, if you are in Tokyo, you know, slurping your noodles is fine. It's in many ways often expected. Whereas if you're sitting in a restaurant in Retford in Nottinghamshire and you do order some noodles from the shop there, you know, slurping may not be received so appreciatively there. Holding doors for strangers, you know, things like this. In one culture it's expected, in another culture it doesn't really happen. Eye contact, and of course things like eye contact are interesting because we attribute meaning to things like eye contact. You know, in lots of job interviews in the UK, for example, you hear, maintain good eye contact with the person who's interviewing you. It shows that you're an honest person, that kind of thing. Shows you can be trusted. Talking to a lot of my Japanese students, they would say, for example, in a lot of interviews in big Japanese companies, they were expected to not maintain eye contact, maybe look a little bit lower than below somebody's eyes. So we can also see differences there. I think it's important to remember this isn't across all job interviews in Japan, but it was for these particular ones in large companies that they were going for. And of course, many politeness strategies are shared across cultures. And this, I think, is something else that's really important to remember in terms of intercultural communication, that we share probably far more than we differ on. But as humans, we're very good at noticing difference and then attributing meaning to that difference, and often attributing negative meaning to that difference, and often attributing the wrong negative meaning to that difference. So these are some of the things that we really need to be careful of. But these kind of statements, like Japanese is the most polite country in the world, does encourage us to focus on cultural difference. And I think as a language learner, it's also important to remember that I think you're often being set up to fail. You're being compared to a norm or an ideal that actual mother tongue speakers of that country don't follow themselves. This isn't just in Japanese, this is in all kinds of language education. And I think there's a liberation if you can appreciate that, because you don't have to, it's all right to make mistakes and things like that. And if you get things wrong, well, you do in your own first language all the time. So, why not in somebody else's language? And then it helps become your language more. Okay, so going back to this point about different groups. Okay, these are some pictures that I and somebody else took around 2015 in Japan. So when I'm talking about different groups in a country, these were different groups that I noticed in Japan. You've got, for example, the top left here, you've got your Elvis biker dudes who like dancing in Harajuku on a Sunday. You've got your local sumo wrestling club. This Bozozoku, the very noisy biker gangs who drive around neighborhoods upsetting the neighbors as much as they can. You've got some Japanese salarymen there. You've got some Shonan surfer dudes. You've got your Genki Genki Oji-san and Ba-san Tachi having a nice dance in their class. And you've got some, there's a couple of Yamamba girls there. This was taken at Disneyland, Tokyo Disneyland. These girls like to go like every month. And then this is me with my some of my students who we went skiing in Hokkaido, so Tokyo University students. So the point is, when I think about Japan, these are some of the groups that I think about. So it's not that one single stereotype. And of course, I have, I'm not saying I don't have stereotypes, but it's a question of trying to break them down by accepting a level of complexity. And of course, if you think about your own nationality, then you'll probably be able to think about these different groups very easily like that. So it's not that groups like this don't exist in other countries, it's just that we don't maybe know them or don't think about them enough. I'll come back to this again later, this picture. Now, I mentioned I was going to say something quickly about intercultural communication and essentialism, because I think essentialism is a very important concept that helps explain stereotype and helps us understand things like Nihonjinron and some other issues that arise in intercultural communication. Here's an example of a meeting that I recorded, and they're talking about Pascal, who's a salesman from another company. And they say, oh, I see, is he French? He's French. He's French. No, he's French. Pascal's very French. And if you look there, no, he's French, Pascal's very French. These are two very different uses of the idea of French, of the word French. So the first one is really just descriptive, describing his nationality. The second is really quite evaluative. And you can imagine this kind of prototype with Pascal right in the middle of this guy's mind of Frenchness, along with baguettes and onions and things like this. This is a really, Pascal's like the archetypal Frenchman in his mind, which, as we find out later in the meeting, is not a very positive view. Anyway, the point is that, when we're talking about nationality, we can do it descriptively or we can do it evaluatively. And this kind of very, very French, very Japanese, very American or whatever, this is tying into this concept of essentialism. Now, Gelman talks about the link between stereotyping and essentialism. She says, stereotyping borrows the language and conceptual framework of essentializing. Essentializing is different groups of people are treated as distinct in deep, non-obvious ways, and social group differences are assumed to be innately determined and fixed. So it's like, you know, you can't not be in that. It's part of you, it's inherent in you. It's very similar concept that's used in some of the old views about race, for example, and thankfully have been rejected. I think sadly we haven't quite got there with nationality yet. Okay, so that's been quite a lot of me going on. What I'd like to do now is play you this video, which I think is a nice interlude about essentialism in action. So we'll watch it and see what you think.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah. Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Okay, so
Fish and chips. Pheasants.
hold on, stop that. Hopefully that highlights essentialism in action. Really, it's, you know, in terms of the guy's views and, you know, how he's projecting his image onto this other person purely based on her physical looks. You know, it's a very inherent view of how identity works operating in his mind, which obviously she reacts to in a nice way. Okay, now going back to intercultural communication more generally and kind of summing up some of the key points that I've looked at here. So stereotypes. So I'd say usually these negative, simplified, evaluative generalizations of other groups. And essentialism, the focus on national difference, usually national, that leads to stereotypes and ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is this view that the way that different people evaluate other groups by their own customs, rules, and put their own group at the top. We're all ethnocentric to some degree, but it's possible to break it down to become aware of our own confirmation bias and these types of things. But ethnocentrism is a very useful tool, I think, conceptually, to when we're thinking interculturally, to be self-aware, to notice when we're doing this. So if you're, you know, reacting negatively to somebody that you perceive as different, and then you're, you know, evaluating what they do, you're probably judging them by your own norms, which is something that we, again, naturally do, but it is possible to break it down. So by becoming aware of things like stereotypes and ethnocentrism, I think we can over time, and it does take quite a long time, I think. I'm certainly very far from where I'd like to be with this. You know, we can reduce our levels of ethnocentrism. Okay. So couple of questions. How should we conceptualize culture and communication, and what should we learn and teach about language and intercultural communication? So, you know, what practically, so these are some of the problems. What can we do about them? Well, I think one thing is okay, we shouldn't, you know, obviously be thinking about things like this. So, you know, it's trying to get away from these very simplistic ideas about, you know, all people from this particular group are like this. And I was trying to think about how we might represent it visually. And for me, it's something like this. When we're thinking about things like identities, group identities, we need to have this notion that it's very complex. And there are no apologies for that, because it is complex stuff. And if you're looking for a simple answer to dealing with things like intercultural communication and cultural complexity, then you know, you're going to be disappointed. You'll be given a map, you know, and there are researchers out there who will give you a map. People like Hofstede will say, yes, Japanese are 76% polite, whereas British people are 47% polite. Therefore, you know, do this. But it just doesn't work in practice. You know, it's a map that doesn't work. It takes you to the wrong place. So we need to embrace this level of complexity. Something else we can do, I think, is conceptualize language differently and discourse. So a really useful concept is being formed by Jim G, called big D discourse. And he compares it to small d discourse. So small d discourse is basically any stretch of language. So this PowerPoint slide here. A sign on the street that says no smoking, a poem on a page written down. These are all stretches of oral written online language. But he said, when we're thinking about communication, we also need to consider the identities of the users and the way that they give context to this language that's being used. And to do that, he introduces the concept of discourse with a big D. So here's one definition of it. So discourse with a big D are distinctive ways of acting, interacting, valuing, feeling, dressing, thinking, believing with other people and with various objects, tools, and technologies, so as to enact specific socially recognized identities engaged in specifically socially recognized activities. Okay, so what does this mean? So it means when we're thinking about communication, we shouldn't just think about the words and the texts. We need to think about the groups of people who are using those words and texts, how they're using them, what kind of identities they are creating through the use of those words and phrases and things, and what other kind of tools might they be using. So let's go back to this slide here. We could term all of these different groups, I think, discourses with a big D, because they've all got just distinctive ways of dressing, acting, they use various objects, they will communicate differently, and they're creating and recognizing different types of identities. I'm going to return to this again in a minute. Okay, what I'd like to do now, just for the final part of the talk, is talk about a little case study. So if you're interested in this, I can send you the chapter. It came out last year now, on a book on consultancy, advocacy, and empowerment in the workplace. And it looks at a company I've called Japan Engineering Corp. That's not the real name. This is a multinational company that I worked with as a consultant for many years, and they build plants, as in like power plants, things like that. They were quite concerned. The reason why they brought myself and Professor Hiro Tanaka, I think is going to give you a talk another time, into their company as consultants to work on communication, because they were worried that particularly their engineers were not being very effective at international sales. So, you know, engineers have all the knowledge a lot of the time, but they may not have the linguistic tools to be able to communicate effectively in terms of something like a sales presentation. This is what the company said. So we had these cohorts. Initially, we were brought in for like 2 years, and we ended up doing it, well, till I left in 2015. And I think Hiro is still carrying on now. I'll talk about that at the end. So it's cohorts of mainly young managers. And initially, all the groups were pretty much 100% Japanese nationals. Over time, the company hired more and more international staff. So the training became more diverse at the national level, which was quite useful, and showed how the company itself was changing. Okay, so in terms of getting a good grip on what we needed to do with it, because it was quite a lot of time and money invested in this training. So we conducted a lot of interviews with senior management. We observed several meetings, and we had, elicited a lot of information over several years from the trainees as well. Something that we noticed was that there was a strong culture of stereotyping based on nationality at many, many levels of the company. And this wasn't the only thing that we focused on in the training, but it was one of the main things that we focused on. And a lot of them reflected, drew on really quite common Nihonjin-ron discourses that you find, at every level of society. So it wasn't particularly surprising. These are some examples of the stereotypes that the employees came out with. So the auto stereotypes about the Japanese people talking about themselves, Japanese employees, and hetero stereotypes about the others. I'll just let you have a quick look through. We've looked at some of these already. And like, lots of stereotypes, that they're lazy. I mean, the first one that I put, Singaporeans are lazy. This was about a particular nationality who use English as one of their mother tongues, as it were. And the Japanese engineers were complaining. They said, when we say something, we'll write it down on the whiteboard so that everybody can understand it. They just sit there and talk, so they're lazy. And I said, well, maybe they just feel that they don't need to write it down because they use English, as you would use Japanese. Would you write things on the board if you were speaking Japanese? And they're like, no. So, this kind of thing. Anyway, so, you can critique it on that, but we felt it needed more than just confronting the stereotypes. So we developed a lot of training to look at that, and we did various things. We looked at things like successful international alliances, because a lot of the stereotypes, we're very much, creating this them and us distinction. Sorry, the slide's gone funny again. Okay. Where was it? Yeah, so the aims of the training was to decouple notions of nationality and culture, critique essentialist explanations, encourage a more positive attitude towards managing diverse teams, because this was becoming increasingly important within the company as well as working with other companies as well. And then on the second day of this main, 2-day main training package, we looked at various communicative strategies for successful intercultural communication. But the first day was a much more kind of slightly theoretical day. We introduced them to the concept of discourse with a big D, which of course, they hadn't come across before. And, very much emphasizing that this is a dynamic notion of social identity, in that we can move in and out of these different discourses. And to highlight that, we had a slide like this, and, said, all of these could be categorized as different discourses in Japan, and somebody may be a member of various different categories. So for example, somebody may be this salaryman in the daytime, and then in the evening, he gets on his, unlikely, but gets on his Borsozok bike and terrorizes the neighborhood. More likely on the weekend, he gets on the train, goes up to Shonan and gets on his surfboard. So, the point is, it's possible to be members, and we all are members in different discourses. We then got them to think about, okay, what different discourse groups can you think of in Japanese society? And then you personally, what groups are you a member of? I should say, of course, I'm just giving you 2 minutes of what was, a whole day or 2 days of training on this. And then with some groups, we actually had them for several weeks as well. This is just a little snippet. What discourse groups are you a member of? What is your work discourse? So when you think about, say, JEC work discourse, what are some typical features of that in terms of things like dress, timekeeping, tools that you have to work with, ways that you communicate with superiors or senior staff, gender communication in the company, these types of things. How about different discourse groups you have to interact with at work? So again and again and again, when we drilled down, the problematic communication was not between different nationalities, although people assumed it would be. In fact, the problematic communication is often between, for example, engineers and salespeople. Those salespeople, I don't understand those salespeople. They just go on, they talk about money. They don't understand what we do. Salespeople are like, oh, engineers, you know, they're just so interested in the detail. They can never communicate properly, blah, blah, blah. So, and again, not just Japanese companies where you get these tensions. These are all over different types of companies. There are other issues as well, but that came up a lot. We also wanted them to focus very much on the benefits of diverse groups, and we looked at some research showing that if you have diverse groups, you get better, provided it's well managed, you get very good solutions to problems. If you have a homogeneous group where everybody's the same, they generally come up with very similar solutions. If you want a good range of different solutions and options, then have a very mixed group. So there are real benefits from this in the complex world that we live in the 21st century. So that was something we did there. Okay. We also, as I say, looked at what at the time was a very successful, what we termed interdiscourse alliance between Nissan and Renault. If you cast your mind back to 1999, Nissan was about to go bankrupt and it was in an awful state. Renault joined them. There was a lot of skepticism in the international market about the prospects for this particular alliance. In fact, the head of GM Motors at the time, General Motors, said Renault would be better off taking $4 billion of gold on a ship and dumping it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That would be a better use of their money than trying to invest it in an international car alliance, because there's no way this can work. However, as of 2017, Nissan was the 5th global car market. Share increase, the sales increased over 400%. So we looked at how that was achieved. Of course, it's gone a bit pear-shaped since, because of course you have issues with the Carlos Ghosn. But anyway, back at that time, it was still very much a successful case. And historically, I think will always be regarded as such. So we wanted to focus on something that was positive rather than negative. Okay, I won't go on through this. If you're interested in this study more, as I say, I can give you I'm happy to send you the book chapter. But in terms of the training, very, very positive responses, over 90% satisfaction rates. It was expanded to lots of different groups within the company. As I said, it's still ongoing. International sales actually improved by 300%. But I think there were other reasons for that as well, apart from the training, but certainly the company were very, very pleased. However, as I say in the article, we think that the value to the company is not just financial, and in terms of internationalizing the organizational discourse of JEC, we are confident we enabled a positive change. So, I think there are, we heard reports from things like their international partners and saying, well, things have changed in terms of how more open and open to ideas, more effectively in terms of communicating, these types of things. Okay, so just to finish off, these are some implications for intercultural communication and language learning. I think overall, there's a lot of emphasis on culture as difference, and I think that's quite problematic. It's often culture as difference in terms of nationality, and it can lead to things like confirmation bias, where we just notice our own stereotypes being reinforced all the time. There's an assumption that cultural difference leads to problems, whereas in fact, diversity is more and more embraced as something that's positive. And differences can be exciting. I mean, why do we learn languages and want to go to different places in the first place? Essentialism makes us focus on a single identity. That's often the national level, and that's a problem. And we need to recognize that we belong to these different groups. We move in and out of them all the time ourselves. So does everybody else. We can change our membership of different groups, and we can become experts of different groups. We may be novices of other groups. And this, I think, the things that I've been looking at today, we could term critical intercultural communication, trying to be aware of stereotypes and thinking about how we can deal with them differently. And these can provide it's a more difficult path in terms of intercultural communication, but I think it's a more honest one. Okay, so with that, I'll stop the slides, and those are some references there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your presentation. Thank you so much. Now we are going to move on to the Q&A time. And then if you have questions on regarding this Mike's presentation, please type your questions in the Q&A function, please. And then we can review them all together. Okay, so let me review the Q&A now. Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, can you keep unmuted? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got the question from Richard Nash. Are Nihonjin views found less in younger people compared to older people? How do you think?
I don't know, would be an honest answer. I think, you know, that there's lots of research showing that, you know, young people tend to, to put it bluntly, are often a bit more open-minded, aren't they? As we get older, we tend to, you know, become more fixed in our own opinions. And certainly, you know, if you look at, I think, you know, my time in Japan, if I compare like what 1994 to 2016, you know, the differences and changes that I saw in Japan on so many levels, you know, things like parenting, that, you know, the way that particularly men behave towards their children, massive differences. But in terms of the pervasiveness of Nihonjin Ron discourses, I still think that they're very strong. So I don't know in answer to your question. I still, when I watch Japanese TV, I still notice, you know, that there's so much happening there that, you know, is very much drawing on these discourses, and things like, you know, as I mentioned, notions of, you know, hen japa, jun japa, han japa. This is a little bit old, but it's probably only like 10 years or so old. I mean, it's still relatively recent that these terms are being bandied about. So yeah. That would be an answer question. You know, it would be an interesting one to do more research on to see that. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much, Richard. And there was other question from Troy. I think the discourse and language and social practice perspective is very useful, making culture internal variability more obvious for those who tend to hold essentialist views of culture. Do you have any suggestions regarding how learners of Japanese might be encouraged to focus on big D discourse and evaluate it against their conceptions and stereotypes of the attribute of Japanese people?
Thank you. Let me just have a quick read of that again. Yeah, well, of course, I'd say thank you, Troy. I think it's yeah, again, a very interesting question, and I think that it's not just about Japanese people, of course. I think maybe that may be the way that I'd approach it if I was starting from the beginning again. So I think this way of thinking, rather than focusing on, you know, big essentialist categories like nationality in terms of identities, it's trying to explore that this non-essentialist view that we belong to these different discourses with a big D, we all do, and we move in and out of them all the time, whether that be people in Japan, people in the UK, or whatever. So I think it's trying to embrace that level of complexity, trying to embrace that level of dynamism in identity, and really trying to become quite self-aware, which is on that level, and trying to notice when we do it. I think it's a really long-term process, though, as I say, because, you know, I've been trying, like, you know, many of us have, I'm sure, but, you know, it's so easy to fail on this, but I think it's just a question of trying to, you know, fail better, maybe. Does that answer your question?
Troy, is that okay? Okay, so if you need to tell us more, Troy, could you send a message to the chat function? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let me move on to the next question from Joy. From Joy, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Can I ask whether you think only Japanese share cultural stereotypes, as you call Nihonjinron? As an anthropologist, I would suggest that is in itself a stereotype.
Yeah, thank you. I hoped, sorry, if I gave that impression, then I apologize. That isn't what I'm arguing at all. Yeah, I think if I was saying that only Japanese share cultural stereotypes like Nihonjinron, then I agree that would be a stereotype, but that's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that I think Nihonjinron is a very powerful identity discourse that runs through Japanese society. But of course, living in the UK, when I came back in 2015, it's been a bit of a shock to see some of the increasing nationalist identity discourses running through the UK over the last 5 or 6 years. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's not just Japan, of course. I think, but because this is a talk about Japanese language, I think it's a very relevant concept for understanding those types of stereotypes within a Japanese context. And for anybody, I've got a nice bookshelf here. Hold on a sec. And for anybody who's interested, this is again a book by an anthropologist, social anthropologist, Harumi Befu. I can never say it properly. Hegemony of Homogeneity. It's a scary title, but it's a really nice read. So it's just getting that out of the library if you want to find out more about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joy. Let me move on to the next question from Christopher. Isn't there an inherent contradiction? We know that over-focus on difference and stereotypes are bad, but not being aware of them lead to a danger of treating everyone the same. Although not as life and death as in the past, and the stereotypes still useful as a shortcut for understanding how people may behave or react. The issue is that stereotypes don't get updated as quickly as they should, and people may not be aware of the greater sophistication of multiple cultural groups and behaviors within one country or group. And then Chris sent me a link. The things that I also discussed in his book, Japan, the Basic, and which he is currently revising for a second edition and what to explore more. So this is a link to Chris' publication here. So can you, if you can check that, please check this link. I'm gonna copy this link to the chat function as well. How do you think, Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, again, it's a really interesting question, and gets to the heart of the matter. I think one thing to say, of course, is yes, we cannot survive without social categorization. We need to categorize things in terms of social groupings, things like that. However, I'm not arguing against categories or categorization as such. And what I'm arguing against is particularly this way, and it's, as I say, it's not just Japan or Japanese, but that's just happens to be the focus that I'm looking at. I've published other areas where I look at other groups and things, and of course you see the same thing happening. The danger is that we trust our stereotypes. Our minds will naturally stereotype, but then if you believe them, and you believe that, okay, for example, Japanese people are very polite, then what often happens is you only notice things that reinforce your stereotype. And also, it can lead you to, it actually can create quite bad communication, because you may think, okay, I need to speak politely to all Japanese people all the time. Whereas, of course, in many situations, that's not appropriate at all. So I think, we do need to have social categories. We need to have information about places, but, the information that you could learn about Japan before going, that is cultural, I think, like in many places, is not a huge amount. But if you are training your learners to expect Japanese people to behave in a certain way, then I think then it becomes quite problematic. I think we need to be teaching our learners to be ready for the complexity and diversity of people that we come across. Because, even whatever level you think about in Japan, if you think about, okay, how are things different in, for example, Tokyo and Osaka, in terms of how you might be expected people to communicate? How might difference be different? How might, for example, a place like, I don't know, Ueno be different at 9 o'clock in the morning if you meet somebody on the street compared to 11 o'clock at night. You know, it's very, very difficult to predict. And what we should be encouraging our learners not to do is to predict. So I think this idea that you can predict behavior based on social categories is problematic. And it doesn't actually help us a lot of the time. Treat the person, you know, we don't communicate, what's the phrase? Cultures don't communicate, people do. You know, look at the person you're speaking to.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Christopher. And let me move on to the next question. That's from David. Thank you, David. Do you think that the tendency towards stereotyping, ethnocentrism, and focusing a lot on cultural difference is more prevalent in more ethnically homogeneous societies?
It's an interesting question, isn't it, as well? Yeah, I don't know. Again, I'm trying to think about, say, societies that are less ethnically homogenous. And you know, you certainly see plenty of these things there as well. So I don't know that. So my probably quick reaction would be not necessarily. But again, I think it would be an interesting one to explore more.
Okay, thank you, David. This is a question. There are more questions, but we've got only 3 minutes. Let me move on to the question from Mano. What is your advice to the Japanese and any people not to have or get rid of these stereotype ideas?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's to all of us, isn't it? I mean, I think the first thing is, I mean, and this is quite personal, I suppose. It's, you know, you have to accept a high level of failure. I think if you're interested in embarking on something like this, that you will never get rid of all your stereotypes. However, it is possible to become more aware over time, and I think personally, I found, you know, reading a lot of literature raised my awareness of the complexity of different places. Of course, interacting with people as much as you can, and you know, again, trying not to predict how they will behave based on how you perceive them in terms of where they come from or something like that. It's really the types of ideas, you know, that I was looking at in the talk, and things like, you know, engaging with discourse with the big D, you know, that kind of notion of dynamism and fluidity in identity, and the fact that we all move in through so many different identities in the course of a day, really.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And then there was another question from my colleague. She said, as a language teacher teaching Japanese, there are we recognize lots of language learning textbooks full of stereotype idea of Japanese or Japanese society. How do you think we should handle with those textbooks with full of stereotype idea towards certain things?
Yeah, no, you don't. I mean, again, it's not only Japanese language textbooks. You see this in lots and lots of language textbooks, don't you? That you know, the Japanese are like this, or you know, this is, people in South America are all very friendly. You know, this type of thing. So the way that I would do it is, again, deal with it critically. You know, shine a light on it, and you know, get the students to explore. You know, does this make sense to you? Do you believe this kind of thing? Can you see any problems with this? And you know, even people of quite a low language level, you know, just because someone has a low linguistic level, if they're a beginner in a language, doesn't mean that they can't think. And I think there's often, you know, it's easy to assume that these kind of things can't be discussed in the person's first language, for example. So I think, you know, approach them critically, shine a light on them, and get, you know, the language class is a great place for discussing these types of things. So that's what I would do.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And thank you, Joy, Natsuko, Barbara, Julia, and Victoria. I am sorry if we haven't got enough time to answer all those questions from you. I am sorry. And then we need to close this session soon, unfortunately. And then all those questions that we haven't, Mike couldn't answer, they will be sent to Mike. I'll do that. And then we'll seek the way to inform you of this later on. Thank you so much for your question. And everybody, thank you for coming to this third Cardiff-Japanese Online Lecture Series exploring sociocultural aspects of Japanese language learning today. And we will let you know as soon as we decide the content of the next Cardiff-Japanese webinar. And also, please do not forget to check the Cardiff-Japanese Online Lecture YouTube channel. That's the link, as I have sent a link to the chat function. So please check that, and then please check that YouTube channel, because there are lots of so many various interesting videos, recorded sessions there. Please check it out, okay? And then also, we'll be very grateful if you could complete the short survey to tell us how you found this lecture and event. And then the survey will be automatically sent to you later. Thank you very much for coming to the lecture. Thank you very much, Mike, for coming, for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's 2 o'clock, so I have to say goodbye. And then please take care, everybody. And then I hope I'll see you soon. Thank you so much. ありがとうございました。さようなら。
さようなら。
さようなら。